In this video, we are going to talk about fungi. So let's start by talking about some of the general characteristics of all fungi. So most fungi are multicellular, meaning that they are made up of more than one cell. There are some unicellular fungi that exist. And unicellular means that they're just single-celled organisms. And a unicellular fungus is known as yeast. Now, there are different types of yeast. There's the yeast that you put in dough in order to make bread rise, but there's also some pathogenic yeast, which causes things like yeast infections. So these are different types of yeast. Yeast is just kind of a general term for any unicellular fungus. Fungi are sessile or immobile, meaning that they are not able to move around in their environment, although some do have flagellated spores or gametes. And flagellated just means that it has a flagellum. Remember, a flagellum is just a kind of a protein cellular extension that helps the cell to move around or swim around in its environment. You will also notice that a lot of terminology associated with fungi has this prefix of myco. So mycology is the study of fungi. A mycologist is a scientist that studies fungi. One neat fact about fungi is that it is believed to be the largest organism on Earth. So scientists in Oregon went around and they collected samples from a fungus over a 2,000 acre area. And they collected the part of the fungus that's underground. And that's this area here is known as the thallus. And we'll talk more about the different parts of a fungus later on. But basically, these scientists went around and they collected these samples from underground and they compared the genetics of them, and it turned out that these cells that they collected all were genetically identical, meaning that they were part of the same organism. So they discovered a fungus that covers over 2,000 acres, and they estimate that it is 2,400 years old. Now, these screenshots are actually from a TED Ed video that talks about the largest organisms on Earth. It talks about this fungus, but it also talks about other really large organisms such as, dinosaurs and whales. But I can't play the video in this program here, but I will put a link to it on the Learning Management System in case you want to go and watch it. It's kind of a short, interesting video. Fungi are eukaryotes, meaning that they are made out of eukaryotic cells. Remember that the other option is prokaryotes. And prokaryotes include things like bacteria and archaea, whereas eukaryotes includes not only fungi but also plants, animals, and protists. So fungi are more related to plants, animals, and protists than they are to bacteria or archaea. And because they are eukaryotes, they have the same characteristics that all other eukaryotic organisms have. So the common characteristics of eukaryotes is that their cells do have a membrane-enclosed nucleus. Remember, in prokaryotes, they do have DNA, but it's in a nucleoid region in the cytoplasm, whereas in eukaryotes, there's actually a membrane surrounding the nucleus, and then the DNA is housed inside that membrane. Fungal cells also have membrane-bound organelles. These include things like mitochondria, endoplasmic reticuli, Golgi apparatus, etc., etc. Because fungi are living organisms, they do have DNA that is packaged in the form of chromosomes. And just like all eukaryotes, their chromosomes are linear in shape. So they have this kind of bar shape. Remember, prokaryotes have a circular chromosome. Fungi also have multiple chromosomes, whereas in prokaryotes, they typically only have one, but in eukaryotes, they might have multiples, or they do have multiple bar-shaped chromosomes. Their DNA is also organized in this substance known as chromatin. And chromatin is just DNA that is wrapped around histones. And histones are just these proteins that help to organize the DNA to help keep it from getting tangled. Now, some fungi do have supplementary rings of DNA, which, if you remember when we talked about bacteria, we talked about plasmids. And plasmids are these little rings of DNA outside of the main chromosome in a prokaryote. So in a prokaryote like bacteria, they've got one big kind of single circular chromosome that contains their genome. And then they have these little accessory rings of DNA that just give them a little extra kind of genetic information that might include kind of benefits like antibiotic resistance. So fungi do have these little extra rings of DNA, but they are like plasmids, kind of, but they're different in their function. So they're not the same thing as plasmids because they are not involved in horizontal gene transfer. So not involved in this. And so horizontal gene transfer, when we talked about prokaryotes, we talked about conjugation. And conjugation is where you have one bacterium attached to another bacterium by a pilus. And then the plasmids, which are these little rings of DNA, are able to be shared from one bacterium to the other through this kind of cytoplasmic connection. But I don't want to confuse you. Everything I'm describing here is not in fungus. So once again, this is in bacteria, not fungi. So they have these little supplemental rings of DNA, but they are different functionally than the plasmids that we talked about in bacteria. Fungal cells have a cell wall. So remember that the cell wall, if we look at a cell here, and we've got the cell membrane, which all cells have a cell membrane. And then some cells have this kind of extra layer that's kind of on the outside or a more superficial area that's known as a cell wall. And not all cells have a cell wall, but we have talked about things like bacteria and archaea and plants. So these all have cell walls. However, the cell walls of the cells of these different organisms do differ in their structure. So for example, the bacterial cell walls are made of a substance known as peptidoglycan, which is a molecule made up of peptides and carbohydrates. Archaea can have kind of a wide variety of cell walls. Some of their cell walls are based on protein. Some are these kind of protein, carbohydrate kind of conglomerations. Some of them are polysaccharides, but they've got kind of a wide variety of cell wall makeup. Plants or plant cells have a cell wall made up of cellulose, which is a type of polysaccharide. And then fungi have a cell wall made up of something called chitin, and that CH at the beginning is pronounced kind of like a K, so chitin. And chitin is also a polysaccharide, which is a type of carbohydrate. But it is a different type of polysaccharide than what we see in plants, bacteria, and archaea. The functions of the fungal cell walls are similar to the functions of other cell walls, however. The cell wall does provide structural support because fungi do not have an internal skeleton like vertebrates do. It helps to prevent desiccation. Desiccation just means like dehydration. So it helps to keep moisture inside the cells so that they don't dry out. It also provides some protection from predators because chitin is a tough substance and it's not easily digestible. And as we mentioned, all cells do have a cell membrane. And remember, the cell membrane is also called the plasma membrane, and it is a phospholipid bilayer. Which means that it has these kind of phospholipid heads and then these tails that kind of stick into the middle of the cell membrane. Now, in addition to the phospholipids, there are also different molecules like proteins and these kind of steroid stabilizers. And this is one area where fungi are different from other eukaryotic cell membranes. So in other eukaryotic cell membranes, so for example, in protists, plants, and animals, cholesterol is a steroid that helps to kind of stabilize the cell membrane and influence its flexibility. In fungi, the phospholipid bilayer is stabilized by another steroid. So remember, cholesterol is a steroid, so they're similar to each other, but it's a different specific type of steroid known as ergosterol. In talking about fungal metabolism, with metabolism, we are talking about an organism's ability to essentially break down molecules, build new molecules, and transfer energy. So we often talk about metabolism in the context of cellular respiration. And cellular respiration is essentially how an organism takes in organic compounds and ultimately is able to extract energy in the form of ATP. And there's a lot of other stuff that's going on in between, the left side of the arrow and the right side of the arrow, but that's kind of the basic background of cellular respiration. So fungi can essentially do cellular respiration in a variety of ways. So remember that cellular respiration can be either aerobic, which means that it requires oxygen, or anaerobic, which means that it does not require oxygen. So most fungi are what we call obligate aerobes, and this means that it can only survive using aerobic cellular respiration. So if you were to take one of these fungi and put it into an anaerobic environment where you take away the oxygen, that organism would not be able to survive. Obligate anaerobes are the exact opposite. So they actually will die in the presence of oxygen. And they survive only using anaerobic respiration like fermentation. And then some fungi are facultative anaerobes. And what this means is that they're able to do both aerobic and anaerobic respiration. And they can survive in both aerobic and anaerobic environments. Now, the key difference here is that aerobic respiration is much more efficient. So if we were to talk about a glucose molecule going through aerobic cellular respiration, for one glucose molecule, we would get somewhere in the maybe like 34 to 36 ATP out of that one glucose molecule. In anaerobic cellular respiration, one glucose molecule is only going to produce 2 ATP. So with facultative anaerobes, if oxygen is present, they are going to conduct aerobic cellular respiration because they're getting a much greater bang for their buck. So they're investing one glucose and they're getting, let's say, 36 ATP out of that glucose. Whereas if oxygen is not present, they're only getting 2 ATP, but they're investing that same molecule of glucose. However, if oxygen is not present, then they can still survive by doing the anaerobic process. Fungi are heterotrophs. Hetero means other or different. Troph means eater. So fungi basically eat other organisms in order to survive. So they actually get their carbon from organic compounds. Now, the opposite of this would be something like a photoautotroph. And a photoautotroph is something like a plant that can do photosynthesis. So plants can make their own organic compounds through the process of photosynthesis, but fungi are not able to do photosynthesis. And this is actually a common misconception. So fungi maybe kind of look like plants, and so people assume that they are photosynthetic like plants are, but they're not. They actually have to eat other organisms in order to survive. So interestingly, fungi have external digestion. So you can see in this picture here, we've got the kind of the mushroom sticking up out of the ground. But the majority of a multicellular fungus is actually located underground. And each of these little like string-like things here is called a hypha, and plural is hyphae. And then all together, this is known as the thallus. And so these hyphae, if you look here, we've kind of zoomed in here. You can see the hyphae right here. And the hyphae are made up of these cells. So each one of these is a cell. And what these cells do is they secrete digestive enzymes externally. So they actually excrete enzymes into the external environment, so into the soil or whatever it's surrounded by. The enzymes break down the complex nutrients into more simple nutrients, and then the cells reabsorb those nutrients and transport them to other parts of the fungus. This is not so different from what happens in humans. So yes, we take food into our body, but we actually digest our food in our digestive tract and then absorb the nutrients across our intestines. And so this is kind of similar in that the digestive tract is not really inside the body. It goes through our body, but it's not really inside the body. These enzymes secreted by the hyphae are known as exoenzymes. Exo should make you think of outside or external. And fungi actually play a really interesting ecological role because most of them are saprobes, also known as saprophytes. And these are the decomposers of the food chain. And so essentially, if it weren't for fungi and other organisms like bacteria are also decomposers, but if it weren't for fungi and bacteria, our planet would just be covered in dead organic waste, so dead plants and animals. But thanks to our decomposers, they go in and they break down dead organic matter and essentially recycle the energy and the atoms and molecules so that they can be used again to make another organic compound. Now, some fungi are parasitic, and you've probably heard of yeast infections or things like athlete's foot. So there are some that are detrimental to organisms. We're going to talk a little bit more about the parasitic forms in a different video. If you've ever gone for a hike in the forest, you've probably seen different types of fungi, and you know that they come in different kind of shapes and sizes and colors. So they do have pigments associated with them, but it's important to note that these pigments are not involved in photosynthesis. So remember in an earlier biology course, you maybe learned about photosynthesis and the pigments in plant cells like chlorophyll that are involved in photosynthesis. But the pigments in fungi, remember, fungi do not do photosynthesis, so these pigments have a different function to them. So these pigments help to protect the organism from UV radiation. This is similar to melanin, which is in the skin and the hair of mammals like ourselves as humans. So UV radiation is a mutagen, which means that it can lead to DNA mutations, which may be detrimental. So these pigments help to essentially shield the DNA from UV radiation to protect that DNA from mutations. Some of these pigments are toxic, which helps to protect the fungus from being eaten by predators. And oftentimes toxic organisms or toxic pigments also are colorful to serve as a warning to organisms. And so oftentimes brightly colored things in nature are also toxic. And you can think if you were an animal in the woods and you go and let's say you eat a bright red fungus and it makes you sick, the next time you see that bright red fungus, you're going to know that, hey, last time I ate that, I got sick, so I'm not going to eat that again. And now that mushroom is protected from being eaten by a predator. So now let's take a look at the classification of fungi. So remember with classification, we are talking about taxonomy, because biologists basically like to compare different organisms and then try to group them together or separate them based on their characteristics. So in taxonomy, we typically start with a broader kind of level and then become more specific. So if we look at the levels of classification, the kind of the broadest level is going to be the domain, followed by the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And once again, we are going from very broad classifications to very, very specific. So each type of organism has its own species name. So starting at the kind of the broadest classification, fungi are in domain Eukarya. We've already talked about fungi being made of eukaryotic cells. So if you recall, the domain, we talked about two other domains in other lessons. We've talked about bacteria and archaea. And then the third domain is eukarya. Now within the domain Eukarya, there are 4 different kingdoms. And so one of them is fungi, but the other kingdoms include plants, so plantae, Animalia, and Protista. So those are the other kingdoms in the domain Eukarya. And then of course fungi. And then we can further classify fungi into one of these 5 different phyla. And phyla is just plural for phylum. So in separate videos, we're going to talk more about the specific characteristics of these different phyla. But just to introduce them here, we have the Chytridiomycota, which are also known as the chytrids, Zygomycota, which are the conjugated fungi, Ascomycota, which are the sac fungi, Basidiomycota, which are the club fungi, and then Glomeromycota. So far, over 135,000 species of fungi have been identified, but it is estimated that there are over 1 million different species. So scientists have a long way to go when it comes to discovering and classifying additional fungi. Now, fungi are often kind of lumped together with plants because they kind of look like a plant. They have this kind of like root-like structure underground, and then they typically have this mushroom kind of growing above ground. But fungi are actually more closely related to animals than they are to plants. And a couple of the kind of characteristics that support this kind of classification being closer to animals is that, remember that the cell wall of fungal cells is made of chitin. And then arthropods, which are insects, and insects are a type of animal. And these insects have exoskeletons that are also made of chitin. And so the exoskeleton of an insect has the same type of polysaccharide as the cell wall of fungal cells. Fungi also have melanin as one of their pigments, and melanin is also found in other animals. For example, human skin and hair, the brown coloration that we get is from melanin, which is a pigment secreted by our skin cells. Fungi also store excess carbohydrates in the form of glycogen, which is a type of polysaccharide. And this is true of animals as well. And as humans, we are animals, and we store excess carbohydrates as glycogen, and that's primarily stored in our liver. Now, plants also store excess carbohydrates, but in plants, it's stored in the form of starch. We mentioned before that unicellular or single-celled fungi is kind of generally known as yeast, and then there are different types of yeast. There's the yeast that we put in bread to make it rise, but there's also yeast that can be pathogenic and cause yeast infections and things like athlete's foot. If we take a closer look at the multicellular fungi, they have two morphological parts or states to them. And we can kind of see that in this picture down here. I'm just going to draw kind of a line here. So we have this top part and the bottom part. And this top part is the reproductive state, or the reproductive part. And it is more conspicuous, meaning that you're more likely to go out in nature and see this part of the fungus. So it's typically above ground. And it's what you would think of as a mushroom. Now, the vegetative state is actually underground. And because it's underground, it's usually hidden, but it's usually actually a bigger part of the fungus than what you see. This picture is only showing you a small part of the vegetative kind of underground part of the fungus. But as we mentioned in the slide about fungi being the largest organism on Earth, we know that this underground part could potentially be thousands of acres large. And then some fungi can actually switch back and forth from unicellular and multicellular forms depending on environmental conditions. So if we take a closer look at the vegetative part, so this kind of root-like underground part of the fungus, we can see that it's made up of these kind of thread-like structures, and a single thread-like structure is called a hypha. Hyphae with that E on it is plural. If you have a network of hyphae, it's called a mycelium. Plural would be mycelia. And then all together, this is known as a thallus. And so the thallus is kind of the overall vegetative part of the fungus. So now if we were to zoom in and look at just the hyphae, so remember if you've got the mushroom above ground and then the hyphae are all these little stringy things kind of underground here. And these hyphae are made up of cells. And these cells can either be separated by these kind of end walls known as septa. So you can see here we've got kind of individual cells. The little dot in the middle is the nucleus associated with the cell. And this would be known as a septated hypha. And one kind of key thing to note, though, is that these hypha are actually connected by these holes that are kind of like gap junctions, so that if one cell has maybe nutrients in it, those nutrients can quickly be transported to other cells within the hypha, so they can share their resources rather quickly. Now, some hypha are aseptate, and A oftentimes in scientific terms means without. So aseptate means without septa. So this is essentially one big cell. All right, so on this outside here, we've got the cell membrane and cell wall. And then within this one cell, we have multiple nuclei. And this happens when a cell goes through mitosis without cytokinesis. So remember that mitosis is the splitting of the nucleus. And so remember in mitosis, you've got the DNA is replicated, and then the nucleus splits in two, and each nucleus gets a complete copy of the genome. And cytokinesis is where the cell itself splits in two. So the cell membrane usually pinches in, and it would form new cell membranes around each of those newly formed nuclei. But in the case of these aseptate hyphae, the nucleuses or the nuclei have separated. So these are the nuclei that have separated during mitosis, but cytokinesis did not happen. So we did not get these kind of divisions between the cells.